Okay. Hi, everyone. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar, which is titled, I'm about to graduate with my PhD. Now what? So this webinar is being offered through the North American chapter of the Society for Psychotherapy Research, or SPR. My name is Averi Gaines, and I am a graduate student in clinical psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I am the student representative for the North American chapter on the sort of like international level SPR student committee. And I am co-moderating this event with my friend and colleague Anuj Mehta, who is a student representative on our chapter level student committee for NASPR. So today we are joined by Stephanie, Brittany, and Kelly, who have generously offered to speak with us and answer our questions about the transition from PhD programs in clinical and counseling psychology into internship and postdoc and beyond. And this is a Q&A style panel, much like one that we would host for students and postdocs at a conference. So this is really an opportunity for folks to get their questions answered if you are coming in with questions. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and provide a brief summary of their professional trajectory. So where did you go to grad school and what kind of program was it? Where did you do internship and what kind of site was it? Where'd you do postdoc if you did a postdoc, and any other positions you've held prior to your current position? And then maybe you can tell us a little bit about your current role. And then I'm going to open things up for questions from everyone that's attending. The chat feature should be enabled. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and Anuj and I can read them aloud. I think that the hand raise feature should also be enabled. So if you would prefer to raise your hand and then unmute and ask your question, that's totally okay too. We will just keep an eye on the order of people raising their hands. Okay. Stephanie, would you be willing to get us started with the intros?
I absolutely can. So first of all, thank you so much for putting together this event. I wish that when I was graduating with my PhD, I had an event like this to attend. So it's really wonderful to be here. It's also really wonderful to see some familiar names on the screen. So just some quick shout outs like Ellie, I see here. I see Maddie Shear. I see Zareen. So some Cornell folks. I just wanted to, hi Ellie. I just wanted to say a really big welcome to everyone, but it's pretty cool to see some familiar names here on the screen as well. So first of all, I will introduce myself because the majority of you have no idea who I am. My name is Stephanie Cherestal, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist who works at Weill Cornell Medicine and New York Presbyterian. But I'll talk a little bit more about myself and how I got here first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what my current role looks like. So I earned my PhD in clinical psychology from Hofstra University in 2019. And it's always so hard to like remember the years at this point. But I started the program in 2013, graduated in 6 years in 2019. And like I said, it's a clinical psychology, excuse me, clinical psych program. When I was at Hofstra University, I joined what was then referred to as the phobia and trauma clinic that specialized in treatment of anxiety disorders, PTSD, phobias, through a lot of exposure-based paradigms that I got training in. I also then became trained in DBT, or I began my training in dialectical behavior therapy, also at Hofstra University. So it was a great 6 years where I got amazing clinical training. I then did my internship at NYU Bellevue, which was also an incredible training year. And then I did my postdoctoral fellowship on the adult psychology track at New York Presbyterian Westchester in their Westchester Behavioral Health campus. So I worked mainly out of the outpatient department, and I did a lot of work out of the outpatient department using CBT and DBT. And right after postdoc, I transitioned into the faculty at Weill Cornell. So that's a position I still hold. So I have been at Weill Cornell since my postdoc, and I still remain here. And I just wanted to quickly comment and say that for some, that's a transition that's common. For a lot of other folks, it can be difficult to transition into faculty at the site that you do your postdoctoral fellowship in. Sometimes it's, well, oftentimes it's a matter of luck and timing and a lot of things coming together to make that smooth transition possible. So I was fortunate in that sense. So I'll try to wrap up and just quickly say that my role at Weill Cornell Medicine changed a few times, which is not uncommon at Weill Cornell and New York Presbyterian, which is one of the exciting things about working there. Currently, my role is the director of the DBT programs in the outpatient department at the Westchester Behavioral Health Campus, which is also a role that they hired me for when I transitioned for my postdoctoral fellowship. The other half of my role involves serving as director of health justice in the Department of Psychiatry. And I can say a little bit more about that particular role if folks are curious about it and have questions about it. But for now, I'll just zip it and say that's what my role looks like right now. And it's great to be here with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kelly, would you feel comfortable going next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to see you all. And also, Stephanie, very cool to hear about your trajectory. So I am also a clinical psychologist. I'll start at the beginning and work forward to which kind of gives you some background for my current role. Prior to grad school, in between in a post-bac position, I landed in a PTSD trauma research lab working with Dr. Laurie Zollner. And that really sparked my interest in PTSD treatment and outcome research. So that was my kind of guiding force in applying to grad school. For grad school, I landed at Penn State in a trauma and PTSD lab where I could kind of dive in there. It was a wonderful experience. I got a lot of training across the board. One thing that was particularly relevant was really solid assessment training, which has kind of been something that what has been really helpful in my current role. And then from there, I went to internship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in their behavioral sciences department, which facilitated a rotation in the PTSD clinic at the Madison VA, which was very important, getting some VA experience there. I moved to postdoc at the Boston VA in the National Center for PTSD, which, given my research area, was a really great place to land. I worked with Dr. Brian Marks there I had been trained in the CAPS prior, gold standard assessment for PTSD, but that was where I really dove in. My postdoc was research based, so I was doing a little bit of clinical work in the PTSD clinic at the Boston VA, but largely it was assessments for, it was the big PE CPT cooperative study that happened. I guess this was about 2015, 2016-ish when we were collecting the data. So I did a lot of those assessments. I think at that point I could probably give the caps in my sleep, probably like 400 or 500 caps at that point. It was a lot. I was doing a lot of them. I got really in-depth training, which was great. Also seeing how cooperative studies work across many research sites, and doing assessments remotely, which was relatively new at that time. So those were done by phone. And so from there, I actually took a visiting assistant professor position at Bowdoin College. I'm from the New England area. I'm from Maine. I actually had wanted to go back to Maine, and so I thought that would be a nice springboard. I've always been someone that likes to do a few different things. And so, I wanted to kind of dive into teaching a little bit more. At that point, I was also continuing to do a few research assessments for a postdoc because at that point I wasn't actually on the job market. I just saw this visiting assistant professorship open up and it happened to work out. And so I left my postdoc a little bit earlier than anticipated. I was there a couple years, but it was looking like it was going to be kind of a 3-year opportunity. So I continued doing some assessments for my postdoc lab while teaching. And at that point, I was also doing some side moonlighting for a group. Not sure if you're familiar with the MAPS Lycos group they did the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD trials. And so I co-led their independent rater pool. So basically training the assessors who did all of the assessments, collecting data for those trials. So at that point, I had 3 jobs. I was teaching and then doing co-leading the assessment pool and doing some assessments myself. I went on the job market for academic tenure track jobs at that point. it was a really good year in Maine. I got a lot of interviews. After I got my first offer, I decided that was actually not what I wanted to do. And so I stayed in the visiting role for a couple more years. I finished up postdoc and started some very part-time private practice. Not private practice, it was a group practice. It was beautiful. I could just kind of come in and see patients, which was wonderful. And that was kind of a nice way to keep my foot in the clinical world while kind of splitting between the research work. So kind of wrapping up my teaching, focused then on splitting between research and clinical. So I was about half and half at that point. And at this point, I was co-leading or co-supervising the independent rater pool for someone else. After doing that for several years, my colleague and I decided that actually having a centralized group of raters trained in assessment, but PTSD assessment specifically, was an area that was a pretty major gap in the fields. And so we started our own assessment company at that point. So we officially started the company about 2 years ago, but we've been doing this kind of work for many years prior. And so it started small, building up research contracts. We currently work on a variety of research trials, some medication trials, some psychotherapy trials. It's kind of nice to have a mix. We started off very small. In the beginning, it was just my co-founder and I doing all of the assessments, and then we built up a pool of independent raters. Right now, we're at about 20, working on different trials across the US and outside as well. We've done quite a bit in Europe and Australia. So at this point, that is kind of the majority of my week. I still do a little bit of clinical work, but that is kind of scaled down over time. It's something that I like to keep a foot in. So I do some clinical work as well, but right now it's really overseeing the assessment company and being in the research world.
Thank you. Brittany, will you take us home?
I will try. Feel free to start playing like the Oscar music if I talk too much. So my name is Brittany Jaso Yim. I am also a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm currently serving as the research manager in industry, working for a program that delivers digital mental health interventions to patients seeking mental health care. But for some context on the long and winding path for how I got there, starting, I think maybe with like post-bac. So I studied developmental psychology in undergrad. I actually worked with songbirds, but knew that I wanted to work with humans. I was interested in clinical psychology. And so I got a post-bac position at the National Institutes of Health. I worked on many of the ketamine trials for treatment-resistant depression that led to the FDA approval of esketamine, specifically studying the mechanism of action of how ketamine impacted behavioral symptoms, but also the neurobiology. And so when I started graduate school at the University of Miami, my research interests were sort of divided. I spent the first few years doing a lot of fMRI research, trying to figure out how we can develop paradigms within the scanner to actually study what I would say realistic responses to stressors. And so instead of showing someone a spider, which is fair, I would probably panic. We actually recruited pre-med students, and we showed them their exam grades while they were in the scanner, so we could study the neurobiological responses to a personally relevant stressor. I love that study. I just think it's incredible. But then I started to realize that I wanted to graduate in a timely manner. And so my research interests also shifted to using ecological momentary assessment or cell phone measurements of emotion so we could better understand emotional responses throughout the day within like short time frames. So measuring emotion, once every 45 seconds for short bursts, just to understand the evolution of emotional responses throughout the day. Following grad school, I did my internship at the University of Miami Counseling Center. I loved working with students, especially students in periods of transition, hence why I'm so excited to be here today with this webinar. And I I had to move to Boston to be with my now husband. And so for postdoc, I got a postdoc position at Boston University. I worked in the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, doing, it was actually wonderful, the job description. They needed someone who had some familiarity with fMRI because they had just started a study. They wanted someone who had experience with ecological momentary assessment so that they could start doing that. And then they had a few clinical trials, or sorry, intervention trials for alcohol use disorders, which is a population that I hadn't really worked with before. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to expand more of my clinical experience in addition to growing my skills in the fMRI and EMA world. As I found out, right, sometimes, whether because of grant funding or shifting changes, right, what is advertised is not always what happens once you get to the role. And I think that's an important message for everyone to know. Sometimes that's wonderful. And sometimes, you find out maybe I'm not as interested in the things that I thought I was interested in. And so following about a year plus of postdoc, I realized that I wanted to find something new. So I got my position 3 years ago as the research manager. I made the leap into industry. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I found a team of wonderful, brilliant academics who also wanted to make an impact in industry. And so I consider myself very fortunate with that. And so in my role now, I love it because I am the research manager. I'm helping with the protocols, I'm helping with the analyses, but I'm also serving as a clinician, not seeing patients, but my clinical insights are being utilized every day as we assess new digital interventions for patients. We determine, do they have a solid research base so we can trust what they're reporting? But then also from a clinical perspective, is there a solid evidence-based foundation to the interventions that we are willing to give to the patients? And so that is where I ended up today.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, I put a little message in the chat that folks are free to pop their questions in there. As I mentioned, if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, feel free to do that. And if things get a little stale, I can get us started with a question too. I'll pause for a moment though. You can ask anything you want within reason. As much as I've gotten better at sitting with silence through my clinical training, maybe I will get us started just to give people a moment to think. So I think all three of you started to touch on this just in your intros that you just gave, but I'm curious, like looking back specifically to graduate school, whether there were particular training experiences that you had, like now that you look back to that time that seemed particularly impactful in preparing you for your current role, or things that seemed like a really important sort of inflection point for helping you figure out what you were interested in or not interested in. I'd be curious to hear about those kinds of training experiences, especially for the folks on the call who are maybe still in graduate school and have opportunities to pursue some of those kinds of training experiences.
I guess I can get us started and just I think speak more generally, or I guess more specifically in relation to my clinical training and then just other offerings that I took advantage of that are just major parts of my current role. So, like I already mentioned, I did some early training in DBT while I was at Hofstra University, and I always saw myself as an adults-oriented provider. And I always knew that just ultimately I was going to continue specializing and work with adults. But I had some really interesting opportunities to further my training in doing DBT with adolescents. I even had an opportunity to work with Jill Rathis at her practice and co-lead some multifamily groups. And these were no I took on these opportunities, again, in no way thinking that I was going to be doing much DBT work with adolescents. And it was also really fortunate because when it came time to concluding my postdoctoral fellowship and transitioning into faculty, one of the roles that I was hired for at Weill Cornell Medicine was to oversee the DBT program, which also involved on the adolescent side. And so I would just say that, like, not having had that experience, I would have felt completely ill prepared to do work in DBT with adolescents again if I had never had that experience. And so it was just really fortunate that I took advantage of opportunities to get training in that space, even knowing that that was never something that I was going to do full time with my clinical practice. And I think the other thing that I wanted to name is that while I was at Hofstra, I also got a lot of opportunities to teach. So specifically teach about like CBT and DBT to more junior students, to undergrads as well. And that wasn't something that I knew where that would necessarily take me. But I have to say that I do so much teaching now in my clinical role at Weill Cornell, teaching to postdocs, externs, interns, and even residents. So really, I would just say to anyone who at your training programs, you might be offered opportunities to teach, whether part of like a larger series or even one-off seminars. Taking advantage of those opportunities is really helpful because like all the more experience with teaching is oftentimes helpful in roles, especially in academic medical roles. So I just wanted to name those maybe two areas.
And dovetail on that a little bit because I totally agree. And one other thing, an experience that I actually did not have as much of in my graduate training or internship that I have developed then on postdoc and beyond is supervision. Like being a supervisor, that's been incredibly important. And it wasn't that I turned down the opportunity. It just kind of never had presented itself, but that is definitely one thing I wish I'd had more of. I totally echo the teaching piece. I think graduate school is a wonderful time to try out different things to see what sticks. Like one of the things that I had mentioned in my bio is assessment. I didn't realize assessment would be something that I gravitated to so strongly or felt like such a good fit, but it kind of fit into my interests and has been kind of where I landed. I got a really strong assessment training in graduate school that then really was furthered, in the VA setting when I was on internship. And then my postdoc was obviously very assessment based. But, I think without that strong training initially in my graduate work, I wouldn't have had, I may not have landed where I did. And so, thinking about what opportunities are available and trying them out to see where your passion lies or what feels like a good fit, and then thinking how you can move that forward, because I never would have thought that I would be here in my career now, right? I feel like for a lot of my graduate training it was like, well, you're going to have to pick research or clinical, like what are you going to do? And that never felt right for me. And so I think having a panel like this and having people talk about, there are other options. And I've kind of forged my own way in a way that feels good and uses my skills and training that I've developed to have kind of a balance that feels right.
Yeah, and I think what Kelly and Stephanie have said so nicely is just, I'm going to call it the intentional yes, right? Because I don't want to tell everyone say yes to everything, because then you end up doing a million things and you're burnt out and you're tired and you don't feel like you have the opportunities to explore your interests. But also don't be afraid to say yes if someone mentions something and it like part of you gets excited, right? Like let that excitement drive you a little bit, even if it may not necessarily align with the path that you had in mind for yourself, because so many opportunities may arise from that. And one of the beautiful things about this training and these programs is that you are acquiring so many skills that you probably don't even know how to articulate right now, but you are always building skills and they will be useful to you in any context that you may be in.
Thank you. Looks like we have one question in the chat that I can read. As someone in the internship application phase waiting for match day, I'm also waiting for match day, so I feel you on that. I know postdoc apps come up super quick, and I'm wondering if you could speak to your thought process in applying for the sort of postdocs that you did, especially regarding the research clinical balance that you've all been speaking to.
I think I may be the most recent one on this panel who went through this. So also, hi, Amelia. Great to see you. So you are absolutely correct. Also, everyone who's in this process, like, feel free to take a breath. I know you're in a very stressful time right now. I think the postdoc application period, I sort of think of it as two phases, right? There's the clinical postdoc, which is a little more formal, and that process more closely represents what you're all going through right now for those waiting on internship. Maybe Stephanie can speak to that better than I can. But I started doing that because I was in a purely clinical internship. And so that is what everyone in the past had done. And so I went through it. It's a match. And then after I had been given an offer, I actually realized I did not want to do a full-time clinical postdoc. I really loved the research. And so this is where listservs really came in handy for me. I knew I wanted research as at least 50% of my postdoc. And so I let everyone in my grad program know that because especially coming from Miami, you have students in adult, child, we have a huge health psych department as well. And so those are a lot of listservs that I was not part of, and they were all posting postdoc positions. And so everyone in my cohort, we kind of banded together and like just sent everything to each other to help us kind of see all the options that were out there. Also for me, I was a little limited on location. I had been long distance with my partner for 4 years at that time while he was in med school, and he was doing residency in Boston. And so I was like, Boston or bust. And I trusted the process because I was like, whatever I do for postdoc, I know I'm going to find something afterwards. And so my advice is maybe don't view the postdoc as the end all be all, but kind of ask yourself, like, what are some of the things that maybe I haven't had experience in that I would still like to gain experience in? Because I think that's a great opportunity for you.
I'll add on and say I totally agree. And also, postdoc is stressful. And also, it's not stressful in the way that internship is stressful because at that point you have your degree. And that is the most important thing, right? And there are a lot of postdocs that don't adhere to the timeline. I did find that stressful because, I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do when I was applying for postdocs. And so I was applying to a mix of research and clinical. Some of the research ones actually did adhere to the same timeline. Like I got an offer from a MyRec that did adhere to the same clinical deadline. So some of them do, some of them don't. I also did some cold emailing, like, given that my research interest was PTSD, being at the National Center for PTSD is, a very good place to be. So I started emailing researchers around there to see if they had postdoc opportunities. And that's actually how I got to my current, or to the postdoc that I completed. But, in thinking about if you're not sure what you want to do, generally a research postdoc gives you more flexibility. Like if you decide that you want to go clinical, starting with research and then having that pathway in tends to be, I think, a little bit easier than if you go a clinical postdoc and then want to wind up in research. Not that it can't be done. I think it's just a little bit easier that way. So research postdocs tend to give a little bit more flexibility that way and do offer some space for clinical work. Not a ton, but there usually is that option.
And I'll just second everything that Brittany and Kelly shared because I think they were spot on. And I actually have little else to add. I think the process for selecting a postdoc can be incredibly stressful. And we are well aware that the internship match process is also stressful. So I also second Brittany's just well wishes for everyone, and you'll get through it. And it's pretty soon, and it can be really exciting. The postdoc selection process, I think, can be unfortunately stressful as well because of the sort of inconsistencies around timelines and things of that nature that even for someone who did a more clinically oriented postdoc and is also now on the other side of it in my faculty role, I am part of like the recruitment group that just really thinks about bringing in postdocs every year. So even sort of being on this side of it, I still see the somewhat chaotic process of there being sort of unclear guidelines around when folks can make offers to postdocs that they're interested in bringing into a site, when you have to confirm that you're interested in taking that offer versus not. Oftentimes you'll get an offer right after an interview, but you have another interview next week that you're really excited about. So it can be a really difficult process, and a process that invites folks to really just practice asserting yourself as much as you can and asking for as much time as possible to make these really important decisions. But I also want to second what Kelly said, that this is an important decision, but you already have your license. At the end of the day, this could be a great opportunity to get more training, but it's also not the end all be all for your career. So if I could just say anything else about how I went through the process of selecting a postdoc, yes, listservs were my friend. So for example, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, I am a part of. I went through all of the postdocs that were posted on that community board. Also, my school's graduate training programs listserv. Oftentimes, sites, when they are recruiting postdocs, will go to the training programs and say, like, hey, spread the word. And so I really relied a lot on that. And I looked for postdocs that were in the New York and tri-state area because I knew that I was inherently interested in staying in the geographic area. And I looked for postdoctoral fellowships that were mostly clinical because I knew I was never going in the research oriented direction, and that offered more training in areas that I was already starting to get expertise in. So just saying a little bit about how I made those decisions, but I also want to acknowledge that it can be a pretty challenging process.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We have another question in the chat. So who, for example, advisors, mentors, or colleagues, if anyone, helped you guide your career decision-making at different points? And what did it look like to develop those relationships over time?
I think that's a great question. Maybe I'll start with this one and say that my academic advisor at Hofstra University, I was super fortunate to connect with. And so this is the person whose lab I was accepted to work with. And I got so much advice from him along the way. And he was a fantastic mentor for me throughout my process in graduate training and even until now. But I will also say that my externship supervisors have been such amazing mentors and advisors for me over time that I really want to emphasize. My transition into faculty, I already mentioned I went straight from postdoc into faculty because someone went to bat for me who was part of the process of hiring for a specific role as a DBT supervisor in the outpatient department. And I had actually seen the job posting go out, but I didn't think I could apply for it. I was like, I'm too junior to be a director of an outpatient training, especially in DBT. So I'd seen the posting. I did not think that I was qualified enough to apply for it. She actually called me personally and encouraged me to apply for it because she'd trained me several years prior. And she was saying, like, a lot of the applications that have been coming in are from fellow junior psychologists, and why not throw your name in the ring? And I say that to say that maintaining that relationship with her as a previous supervisor was increasing was I don't know, unspeakably invaluable. And really just maintaining those contacts every few months, reaching out to your old supervisors and giving them a status update about kind of where you are, asking them how they're doing, to just maintain those networks is really important, as opposed to seeing this as a training year and then you kind of go your separate ways from old supervisors. So I say really lean on those networks.
Oh, I totally agree. I also think it is a balance of, like, I have had wonderful mentors and supervisors and academics that I've worked with. And also, as I mentioned, I don't know if this has changed given that you all are graduating more recently, but really the research versus clinical thing felt like a very intense, like, you have to choose. And that was something that sometimes felt like, for example, I love my graduate mentor, but when I decided to turn down a tenure track faculty job, that hit her hard. And I think the best she could do was, I'm happy, you're happy. Right. So sometimes it's a balance of, like, talking to mentors, talking to advisors, and also, like, I will say I will absolutely not be where I am today without the training, specifically, in graduate school, but also in my postdoc at the National Center. those contacts and mentorship for Brian Marks really springboarded connections with other researchers looking for, PTSD assessment. Like that was invaluable in my trajectory. And also sometimes it's a balance of kind of listening to the mentorship and also noting that the field has changed and there are, more of these positions that do involve different skill sets or that don't fit cleanly into, I am an academic med center researcher and that is my full role. It's a balance of like, yes, those relationships and mentorship have been incredibly important in my career trajectory. And also sometimes it's brushing off this like, what you're going to do that, or like, are you sure? Because, for me specifically, there is some risk, right, of starting your own company, of, we all know the working in research is never guaranteed because of funding. And so, there are some risks inherent to that. So it's a balance of getting information from people you trust and also thinking about what makes sense for you moving forward in your career trajectory.
Those were wonderful answers. I think the only thing that maybe I can add as someone who had purely clinical advisors or purely academic advisors, when I decided that I was thinking about making the leap into industry, I felt like I didn't have a lot of people to talk to. I had a few older graduate students from my program who had done that, so I reached out to them. And then also there's this wonderful Slack channel called Therapists in Tech. It's so incredibly helpful, and that actually became my resource for transitioning to industry. I networked with people, I met people, and I learned how to convert a CV to a resume. I learned about the different ways that I can use my degree in industry. And so I think that was an incredible resource and probably one of the primary reasons that I was able to make that transition from academia to industry as quickly as I did.
Therapists in tech. I just wrote that down. Thank you all. I think we have a question that dovetails nicely with this conversation. So Grace is also awaiting internship match and writes, because internship has such a different structure than grad school and more independence. I'm curious what advice you have for approaching this short but rich training year. Thank you.
This one is a great question. I saw it pop up in the chat, and so I was giving it some thought. As I was reflecting on the question, I wanted to acknowledge that like the internship year can be an amazing year. It can also be a challenging year in so many different ways. And my eyes caught on to the term more independence. I actually in my internship didn't feel like I had that much independence. There were a lot of expectations, certain amount of demands, and there was a certain timeliness by which things had to be done. I say all that to say I have way more independence now in my faculty role than I did during internship. So I think what I want to acknowledge is that it's a very different structure than graduate school. And in a lot of internships, you have opportunities to train in multiple different spaces, say within like a hospital system, if you connect with an internship that way. I can probably speak less to like private practice internships or anything like that, but let's say you're going for an internship in an academic medical center or a hospital, you oftentimes have opportunities to rotate in like inpatient, outpatient, partial settings, IOPs if those are available, CPEPs if those are available. And I say all of that to say that what I found really helpful in terms of that very different training structure of like maybe spending 3 months in one space and then transitioning to another is that it gives you an opportunity to see what settings are for you and which are not for you. And I learned a lot with regards to all of the spaces that I trained in during my internship at Bellevue that spoke to where I could see myself and landing in sort of the outpatient space, but spaces I knew that I would never come back to after the rotation was over. And I think learning from that, going with it and reminding yourself that like even if you find yourself in a rotation that is not your favorite, give it a few weeks, it'll be over. And you can pat yourself on the back that you gave it a try and that you now know it's not for you. I say approaching it with that sort of open mind and recognizing like even if you're training in a space that is again not going to be your favorite space, that in and of itself is such a beautiful opportunity to learn from. So I just wanted to speak to that as like one of the differences I really felt when I transitioned into my internship.
Yes, Stephanie, I feel like your description of like patting yourself on the back for doing it really beautifully describes my child therapy rotation on internship. I tried it. It was not for me, but I did it and I got through it. I would agree. I did not feel like I had more independence on my internship year. It was really structured and I got great training, but like there are requirements for how much supervision you have, which is a lot. Like your schedule is often very laid out for you and it's very structured, which is very different from graduate school and from my postdoc experience, which was much more flexible. So that felt overwhelming. Like I was very tired my internship year. It's just a huge adjustment and, often earlier in the day from an academic schedule. So those were some big shifts. It did feel like kind of my week was slotted for me. And I agree, there are so many rotations to choose from and thinking about like what is most important to you. Like for me, I landed at the University of Wisconsin and their psychiatry department, and it was the only non-VA I applied to. So I knew a VA rotation was really important for me, and I knew I wanted to get trained in DBT because that was not something that I had the opportunity for in graduate school. And so thinking about like what are the holes that can be filled or like that are really important to you, and then there are some that may be required, or then you can kind of pick some optional ones to see, what fits and what may not. But know that it's a lot. Internship is a lot. It's a big shift. And then you're thrown into, we were talking about before, you're then thrown into the postdoc application. It's a really exhausting year. I was also finishing my dissertation on my internship year, which plug for if you can do that before, definitely do it because it's a lot. But you will get it done. It is a year that in retrospect went pretty quickly, and then you move on. But thinking about how you can fill maybe some of the gaps that you were looking for, or to try something that you're like, oh, maybe I think I would really like this.
Yeah. I think I'm just gonna validate the statements that internship is exhausting. For me, it was 9 to 5. My day was fully scheduled. I did have a lunch break, but it was the first time that I was doing clinical work for at least 5 hours a day, and it's exhausting, it's draining. And so really like get your self-care figured out beforehand. Try to practice it as much as you can. Give yourself time to adjust as well. Similar to Kelly, I was also doing my dissertation, finishing it up, and my supervisor told me, don't even look at it for the first 6 weeks that you're on internship. Like, take this time to really get used to where you are and to adjust to this schedule, because it's very different from grad school where I had free time to do whatever I kind of wanted to once I was done with classes. So give yourself patience. Another thing that my program, my internship site, I was able to choose my supervisors, which was the first time I had ever been given that opportunity. And so that was another opportunity for me to kind of think about like what types of intervention modalities am I not as comfortable with that I want to learn more about. And so that was a really fun aspect of where I went for internship as well.
Thank you. Stephanie, was there something you wanted to add? Okay.
No, that really great answers.
Yeah,
I'm preparing to speak to the question in the chat, which is a great question.
Yeah.
Did you read it out loud? Just yeah.
Yeah, I can read it maybe just for the recording. So Tina, who's from my graduate program, writes that she's currently a postdoc at San Diego State University and wanted to hear from Stephanie more about your social justice position. What does the position entail? How did you come into the role? And also, given the current political climate and attacks on DEI, do you have a pulse on the future of these positions and any strategies you're thinking of in continuing this work with potentially less support than in the last few years?
Yes. Well, first, Tina, I'll use the nickname too. That is such a fantastic question I mean, it comes along with so many thoughts for me that I just want to second Brittany's joke that if I go on for too long, please play the Oscar music and we'll move this along. But starting with how I got into my current role as Director of Health Justice and how I got here. And I think that this can be helpful for a lot of folks who might transition into any role that involves health justice or DEI as part of your academic career. Where it all started for me, I think it also happened to involve timing and happened to involve throwing myself into this area as I knew it was something that I was always passionate about. And how do those two things come together? As a Black woman in this space, I was always well aware of the need for just increased diversity as it relates to psychology and sort of within the profession. I wasn't exactly sure of how much I would feel that as a psychologist, but I knew that this was always something that I was well aware of and well aware of the importance of talking about. I happened to be doing my postdoctoral fellowship in 2020 when obviously the pandemic began, the Black Lives Matter movement resurged, and there was a lot of conversation at my setting, New York Presbyterian and Weill Cornell, about what all of this meant, and particularly a lot of folks struggling to think about what this looks like in their clinical practice. As patients were bringing this up in the therapy space, a lot of folks felt ill-trained on how to most effectively respond and were struggling with this themselves. And again, we're less confident in how do I show up as a provider, knowing that I am struggling with my own awareness of how these issues are showing up for us politically. So I say all of that to say that at that time, I volunteered to lead a lot of discussion groups around this with some of my colleagues, not necessarily feeling like I had necessarily an expertise over, say, anyone else, but I knew it was something that I was interested in and that I felt comfortable facilitating discussion groups around. That sort of evolved from there. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how it evolved and in sort of what stages and iterations, but we went from these kind of discussion groups to putting together sort of formal trainings in the Department of Psychiatry. And so it really just built from there. I say all of that to say that when I was offered a role as director from Health Justice, it was something that I knew I couldn't take up or pass up the opportunity to participate in. Now, I say that to say that I took on this role, Director of Health Justice, in 2020. And obviously, right now, the political climate has shifted pretty significantly away from, say, leaning in favor of any sort of DEI initiatives and academic medical centers including, or sorry, the world, including academic medical centers, hospitals, are faced with this question of, well, what does that mean now for our DEI programming that perhaps we started around the same time as we did at Weill Cornell Medicine, or maybe even stemmed further back from that. And I think it's hard for me to speak to what this will look like globally as a field. But what I can say is that I'm incredibly fortunate to work in a site that, as soon as we started having more of these dialogues, there were statements that were made from the dean of the medical college all the way down to the chair of our department that our investment in these areas remains the same. And that's not something that they're wavering on. And so my role will remain. And I think it's also fortunate that we can do this work without sort of the necessity of federal funding. So I just wanted to name that as well. A lot of our programming is funded directly by our department and doesn't rely necessarily on federal funding in a way that I would say is fortunate. And that if we're not the case, we might be facing a lot more by way of risk in terms of changes that would be coming down our way. So that in particular is important. If, say, as part of my role, I launched a summer program for undergraduate students who've been historically underrepresented in medicine who are interested in pursuing a career as a psychologist. And we started a summer internship program that has a stipend attached to it. I say all of that to say that if we got that program off of the ground with federal funding and grants that rely on federal funding, I would be thinking about more private grants. I would be thinking about tapping into like philanthropy dollars. When you get into program development, you get a lot of information about all of the various ways that money comes into hospital systems in a way that's really interesting. But I would probably be tapping into more of like the philanthropy dollars as opposed to federal grants. And so I would be needing to think a lot differently about how to sustain the work that we've been doing now. I'm going to probably zip it and just say that I'm really fortunate to work in a site that continues to carry that same investment in this work that it did 6 months ago. And I hope that that remains the same. Hard for me to predict the future and hard for me to predict what this will look like at any other site aside from the one that I'm currently in. But I think really thinking about, well, where are you looking for funding and where is it coming from? How does that mean that we have to be creative in terms of how we're marketing our work? A lot of folks are having these conversations now. But maybe I'll stop there and really just invite Christina with that question. If you want to keep talking about this, feel free to take my contact information because it's going to be an ongoing dialogue, I would say, absolutely within this next year, especially.
Yeah, I just want to thank Tina for asking that important question, and thank you, Stephanie, for your wonderful response to it. I want to say before we move on, we have about 8 minutes. So, and we have, I think, two questions from the chat. So we'll make sure that we can have enough time to respond to both of those. Okay, I'll take Diego's question, who's also from our department at UMass. Diego said that a lot of programs and advisors just prepare you for a tenure track position. So in this case, how do you market yourself in non-academic positions when academia is all that you know? And how do you know what non-academic positions you can excel at when industry and clinical positions seem very different and nebulous?
I'll start and I'll try and keep it short, but please, like, feel free to reach out to me for more questions. I think one of the greatest challenges is that academics have a certain language that we all understand and we speak, and those in industry do not. And so one of the greatest challenges is you have tons of skills. You have so many skills that you take for granted that you now have to articulate and speak to. As a PhD, took it for advantage. You can send me a data set. I can extract what I need. I can look at it. I can tell you a story and I can describe it and give you suggestions for best next steps. In industry, I've experienced firsthand, there are separate people who pull data. There are separate people who may organize it. And then there are separate people who disseminate it, right? We're able to do all of that. And so oftentimes the letters PhD, we understand what that means. We understand all of our training. But now if you're moving out of academia, you really have to start thinking about what you want to highlight, because a resume is 1 page instead of our 12-page CVs, which is a nightmare in and of itself to create. And I think that's why, again, I said this earlier, but I really relied on the community of therapists in tech, because those were people in industry who, a lot of them dedicated a lot of time to helping me and others learn how to start speaking this new language, which as clinicians, and to just with time in mind, I hope I say this name correct, is it Gael? But languages, right? Clinical modalities are all different languages, and you may start to pick up on similarities between them, but they use different terms. So all of this is about, I think, trusting yourself to be able to rely on your ability to adapt. And it's okay to be overwhelmed and scared, and it's normal. And so a lot of this is just trusting yourself. I hope that I tried to answer both at the same time. I'm sorry. I hope it made sense.
I totally agree with everything you said, Brittany. It can be overwhelming of like, we're all in this world where we all kind of speak the same academic jargon and then having to do it differently. Like, I'm in a position right now where I have contracts with like biotech companies or pharma companies that don't speak the same language, but I also have contracts with academic research groups. And so sometimes it's, code switching in the context to, facilitate effective communication, or things that might be really obvious to one group of researchers may not be in a different context. And I would echo, part of it is trusting yourself and thinking about how to effectively communicate your message. I will also say the marketing piece is a challenge, right? That's not something that we were really given a lot of background in. My co-business owner and I, she's a clinical psychologist as well. We met on postdoc. And, we've been talking about like the business piece, the marketing business. Those are things that we don't get trained in that can be really relevant. And so thinking about, how to build in support for those pieces that are missing, like, the Slack channel that Brittany was mentioning, or, people that may have expertise in these other areas, to kind of round it out, but also knowing that part of it is just, being confident in the skills that you have and just finding an effective way to communicate that in whatever context you're in.
I have little to add, and I want to be brief just because of the time. But I also want to acknowledge that, not being necessarily an industry, I can think about this question somewhat differently, in that there are a lot of roles that are both academic and clinical. And so for anyone who, say you're in a graduate training program that is very heavily research focused, and that you've been on sort of this tenure track for maybe even the majority of your graduate training, that's the beauty of having internship. That's the beauty of a postdoctoral fellowship year, to really fill in whatever you feel like are and I don't want to call it gaps, but the pieces that are less heavily represented in terms of your experiences. And if that means going a very clinical route by way of private practices, I'm sure they will have you. And so we really like create like those additional years to create more of that balance in terms of your yeah, your background. I think that can be really helpful. And it's incredibly helpful to have both sets of experiences in terms of whatever role you'll be transitioning next. So there's still time.
Awesome. And I think we've started to speak to Gail's question, but as a current graduate student, how typical is it to feel overwhelmed by the different treatment modalities and resources that you get exposed to, as well as supervision styles, and whether internship year brings more clarity and confidence in your clinical abilities and helps you solidify your skills? So I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that point, but.
And just start by saying yes and no. Internship goes so fast. It's like a lot all at once, and you do learn a lot. And also, it happens so quickly that it can feel really overwhelming, right? You're constantly picking your next rotation or applying for postdoc or finishing your, like, there are so many things that just come so quickly that you are expanding your skill set and you're learning new things that are really important. And also, it can feel just kind of like, trying to drink from a fire hose because it's a lot all at once. And so part of it is, making space for the dialectic of like, yes, you are learning wonderful, great new things that are expanding on your already solid skill set. And at the same time, it can feel really overwhelming. And part of it is, getting back to what we were saying before, trusting in, your skill set and knowing that, like we were saying before, different modalities have different language for often very common themes. So trying to kind of take a beat and looking for the commonalities can be helpful.
No, it's a great point. I would say that it is difficult and it goes by so quickly. And I would say that I was at least surprised to see that within myself, how much more confidence I had in my clinical skills at the end of the year. So I guess I would just encourage everyone to just keep reflecting on that because it does come to you. But sometimes the year is so fast that it's hard to notice.
Okay, well, I'm seeing our time, so maybe we can end things here. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for spending an hour with us today to talk about just a really important topic. Selfishly, I sort of made this panel based on my own interests and my own professional needs, so I'm hoping that other people benefited from this discussion as well. If any of our panelists feel willing to put their email in the chat, I think I'm just going to have the call stick around for a couple more minutes so that people can write down that contact information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, happy to connect. And thank you for inviting me here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, this was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
All right, bye everyone. Take care.